my favorite part of diversity and inclusion is when it starts with Belgian waffles and strawberries. That is excellent work, team. And I'm also so impressed at how many folks came out to this. I know we've already acknowledged that they were anticipating maybe around 30 people and had over 70 show up this morning, and that's incredible. So thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here. And I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the organization I work for, just to ground that context. How many folks have heard of Community? 8 of you. You all get donuts after. Perfect. Okay, so just to round that out for the folks who aren't familiar with the organization, Community is BC's Queer Resource Center. We're physically
shaking it up
dramatic. Yeah, we make a big impact. We are physically located in Vancouver, and we are actually celebrating our 36th anniversary this year. So we were founded in 1979, and last year we reached 43,000 different people across the province. And we do that, in short, what we do is make queer lives better. And then the slightly longer answer is that we do that in 4 main ways. We provide direct services to folks, and so we have the largest queer youth program across the province. We run 2 weekly drop-ins and average between 20 and 40 youth every week. We do seniors programming, and we offer free professional counseling. We offer over 700 hours a year of free professional counseling. We put on special events like Queer Prom, which is the most adorable thing in the world. We have 300 youth come from all the way from the island, from Abbotsford, from across Metro Vancouver to line up in their best outfit. And so we do a lot of sort of like direct events and services for folks. We also do a lot of education and training. So we come into organizations like BC Housing or other government agencies, other social profits. We go into the private sector and deliver what we call queer competency training, so talking about diversity and inclusion. And so I'm doing a little snapshot today, but our average workshop is 4 hours, and so keep that in mind as I'm talking about concepts. And I know there's some interest in bringing us back to do that, and so I'd encourage you folks, if you're interested today, to come out and delve in a little more deeply. We put out a lot of resources, and one of them that might be really helpful, because I won't go into detail today, is a glossary. And so our glossary goes well beyond LGBTQ. There's about 70 different words in there, and is a free downloadable tool on our website, which I branded very loudly right here so you can all remember. And then we also do some advocacy work, and so we do a lot of work in the media addressing issues that come up. We do a lot of writing. You might have seen our content in some of the mainstream papers. Last year we featured a project that we worked on for 2 years called Aging Out. So looking at the #1 fear among older adults in our community, which is as they, and this is particularly apropos for BC Housing, it's a housing issue. When seniors are aging out of their homes and moving into care, the #1 fear in our community is that they'll have to recloset. Because care homes are fairly homophobic, transphobic institutions, because we've never had an out generation of seniors before. And so folks just don't usually consider it and what the implications are. And so we spent 2 years working with the community members, with care homes, with government. BC Housing was actually part of our focus groups, and had a number of policy forums, and put together some recommendations and released them in September. And it was really exciting because our little organization in Vancouver, Canada, actually got Globe and Mail national coverage on this project. And so we do work like that. And lastly, we just create a space for connection. So we actually have a physical space. It's a little inadequate right now. We've been there for 31 years, and it's kind of up a narrow set of stairs and around a corner right in the middle of the neighborhood. If you've seen the rainbow crosswalks, that's us. Very subtle. But our most exciting announcement is that last year we secured $10 million through the City of Vancouver to develop a new purpose-built facility that's really going to be that cutting-edge, beautiful, warm, safe, welcoming, inclusive center for everyone in our diverse communities. So we're working on building that right now. Now I want to locate myself in this conversation a little bit. I identify as a queer, white, cisgendered, able-bodied, Canadian-born woman. I'm an Anglophone. And so as a result of that, I experience a lot of privilege. And I just want to acknowledge that from the start. I also want to do a quick language note. I've probably said the word queer 72 times already. That might come off as shocking to some of you folks in the room. Queer is what I'm going to use as an umbrella term to talk about everybody in the LGBTQTSAA communities and more. And so I do that for a couple of reasons. One, we think of queer as the most philosophically inclusive language piece. There are a lot of identities, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, probably some of the words you're most familiar with. But if you dropped into one of our youth programs, you'd hear pansexual, two-spirited, asexual, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, and many more. And that's not super pragmatic either for me to name all of those every time I'm talking to you folks today. So the second reason I'm going to use queer is because it's a little easier. And I welcome folks to use that with me as well. So one of the most common questions I get asked in my work, especially from really well-intended, like-minded allies, and usually based in urban centers, is like, aren't we kind of past this? Like, I know a million gay people, like, isn't everything cool? And I do feel extraordinarily privileged to be living in this city, in this country, as a queer woman, that I have it pretty good relative to most countries in the world. There are still 78 countries in the world where it's a crime to be gay, and 7 where you can actually be killed for being gay. And so that's part of that privilege I was talking about. I'm lucky to be Canadian. And yet, despite all of the legal equalities that our communities have won, they haven't translated into lived equalities. So the day-to-day experiences for a lot of queer folks are still one of discrimination. And sometimes that's really overt, and I'm going to give a few examples. And sometimes that's a lot more subtle, and we might not even be aware of our own biases or the language that we're using with other folks that might potentially exclude them, the opposite of inclusion. So I'm lucky that I work in a pretty gay-friendly organization. I'm a little bit out. So that's great, and I have gotten even more out now that I'm gay for pay. It used to be I walked in a room and people, often made the assumption that I was straight, in fact, and now I have like this big pink beacon, kind of shining, which is great, that's fine. But I want to share a story. I've worked in many jobs. I've been at a community for about 3 years, and so most of my career is not being professionally queer, and therefore I've had various experiences. So I want to share a story that actually I used to work in the city of Burnaby, and this happened in Burnaby. I was new at my job and excited, first day, you're checking out your outfit and trying to make a good impression on new colleagues and build rapport with people in the organization, and it was a large organization. And so, it was a very friendly organization, but I didn't know anyone. And I remember, day 2, one of my office mates, knocks on my door and is kind of like, hey, hi, introducing himself, being really friendly. And maybe, the second question he asked me is so, do you have a boyfriend or a husband? And there's this really awkward moment there, right? Because I don't sense any malice. Probably he's not going to care if I tell him actually I have a partner and she's a woman. But I feel horribly awkward because that is not the first thing I want to identify about myself. And also I don't know this person. So I don't know if maybe there is an issue there. I mean, the majority of Canadians support same-sex marriage. It's about 68% when we poll. That means there's, oh God, math out loud, 32% that don't support, right? And so I just don't know, and it makes me uncomfortable, and I immediately closet. I don't reveal. So I say no, which is the truthful answer. I did not have a boyfriend or a husband, but I don't say that I have a female partner that I live with. And yeah, so he's like, oh great, well I've got this friend, and he seems really cool, So yeah, it's a little bit awkward, right? And I'm like, oh, that's so great, thank you, really nice to meet you. And I think that happens a lot. I can think in my own circle of lots of folks that are out to various degrees in their lives. They might say they're totally out, and then conversation comes up over drinks or something, and they're like, oh no, not with that client, absolutely no, because I don't know how they would perceive it. They work in a really macho industry, I think it might impact my career development. At Community, we had an RBC branch manager come in RBC gave us a donation, and so we were doing like the photo shoot with the youth and so on. And he was sharing his story that like he's pretty out. He's married to his husband. He's been out for a long time. He's not out at his branch in Abbotsford because he feels like it would deter the clients. So it's not, in this case, he didn't feel uncomfortable with RBC or his organization, but the community that he worked in, he was definitively not out. So just a reminder that we're not quite there. I want to share a few more examples in and outside of workplaces of what queer folks experience on a day-to-day basis that not everyone might think about. So many stories. Where do I start? Let me share one at a community center, which is, you know, a public space. We all have community centers wherever we live. This one took place in Coquitlam, and I have permission from Michael to share this story. Michael was working out in Coquitlam. He was a resident of Coquitlam, and he always worked out at this gym. And one day while he's doing his weights, there's a staff person for the community center who's talking to another patron, and they're talking about celebrities. They're talking about Heath Ledger, and Heath Ledger's really good looking, and that kind of thing. You talk about this, right, at the water cooler? Yeah.
We will now.
I talk about Natalie Portman. I don't know who you're. She's very good looking. So they're talking about Heath Ledger, and then the employee of the community center is like, oh, but he did that movie Brokeback Mountain, and the sex was so disgusting. So Michael immediately gets very uncomfortable, right? There's been this overt homophobic remark, and all of a sudden, as a gay man, he thinks like, well, like, what does this person think about me? I'm not comfortable working out. And the conversation continues in this kind of homophobic vein. They're not paying attention to him. He gets so uncomfortable that he leaves his workout. He goes to the front desk of the community center to explain what happened and complain and say this, you know, I don't feel safe in this environment. And the response from the woman working at the front desk was, well, let me share this staff person's schedule, and then you can come and work out when she's not here. Wow. Not appropriate, right? Long story short, Michael got in contact with us. We talked to the director of HR. Immediately they were like, oh, that's completely inappropriate. Let's bring you guys in for a queer competency training. And, you know, I do think we made some progress. Michael wasn't looking to make a fuss. He just wanted a safe place to be able to work out. I hear stories like this every week. Another very different example of how queer people experience bias in public spaces, and I have permission from my partner to share this one. So Nada is a cisgendered woman. Does anyone know what cisgendered means? No. Okay, good. This is why we're going to come in and do a queer competency training. This is a good one, because it's a word that a lot of folks don't know, including in the gay community. So I identify as a cisgendered woman, and really simply you could think of it as the opposite of transgendered. Transgendered, trans is an identity where someone's gender identity, how they feel about themselves, doesn't match with their sex that they were assigned at birth. So I was born a man, but I identify as a woman, I would be a trans woman. I was born a woman and I identify as a woman, so I'm a cisgendered woman. Does that make sense? So everyone is cis or trans. So my partner is a cisgender woman, and I think she looks very female-y, not a word, and we can make up our own vocabulary, but cis is a real word. So she probably gets harassed in washrooms once a month. Where she comes home and she's just like, oh, it happened again. And I've seen it where like we're walking into a washroom on Granville Island, and once like somebody grabbed her shoulder and pulled her back and was like, excuse me, sir, like that is not your space. I feel like people really know which washroom they should be going into, and they should be able to choose that without being harassed by a stranger who's decided which washroom is more appropriate for you. So the washrooms are a really difficult space. Very much so for trans people, but not just trans people, also for people who don't necessarily get read as the gender that they identify as. Like I said, my partner identifies as a woman, is a cisgendered woman, and gets harassed regularly. So another way that queer folks often experience discrimination publicly. And just maybe a last story, because I think this one's kind of fun. Again, I have permission to share from the chair of the Board of Community. She is a mother of a JJ is turning about 3 now, and she and her partner have him in daycare locally. This is in East Vancouver. And JJ was just starting to get his words. He was about 2.5, and his language was a little bit delayed. And he kept coming home, and when Sonia and Morgan would say, oh, like, you're 2 mommies, he'd be like, no, 1 mommy, 1 mommy. And they were like, oh, like, maybe he's just, I don't know, like, maybe his language isn't catching up, right? And so that, like, went on for a few months until he starts to get a few more words, and they have an interaction at the daycare and realize that the teacher at the daycare has been correcting him every single day. So JJ would come in and say 2 mummies, and they would say, no, 1 mummy. And so JJ was like, oh, okay, and came home and said 1 mummy, right? And I actually don't think this was a case of overt homophobia, that the daycare workers had a problem with 2 moms. It was just an assumption, a heteronormative assumption, I'll come back to that word, that everyone's straight, and so obviously he was wrong. Right? But it reinforced potentially a dangerous idea for Morgan. They had a lot of fun at that parent-teacher interview. So heteronormativity is, I think, one of the things that really informs those stories that I was telling you about, which is that it's the assumption that everyone is straight until told otherwise. And everything reinforces this, you know, from like the language we use, like every lesbian I know is pregnant or just had a baby, and like, so I'm thinking about babies a lot, and that was sort of irrelevant, I guess. Just seeing my partner and I keep being like, what's happening? Is it in the water? I don't know. So there's a lot of babies out there. And when we talk to babies and small children, you know, we're always teasing them about, like, if it's a little girl, oh, are you going to marry that little boy baby, right? And we don't often look at, like, 2 little girls and say, oh, are you going to get married, right? So just an example of how we reinforce straightness in the language we use, in the images we see, in pop culture, all kinds of things just assume that we're straight. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have a problem with gay people. If I said, oh, these 2 little girls are going to get married, you might be like, oh, great, awesome, yeah. But it's not the first thing you think of. So heteronormativity is that assumption that everyone else is going to be straight, or normativity, if you don't make it about queer issues, is just the assumption that everyone is like you. And that sort of leads into privilege, because there's a privilege that comes with being part of the majority group. And you could extract this to apply to all the diversity topics that we heard about this morning, from your gender to your class to your ability to your race. When there's a majority group, you don't really have to question things. You just kind of assume them to be true, and that might not be the experience for other folks around you. So, for example, there's a privilege that able-bodied mobile folks have that we talked about this morning in terms of getting into a building. I don't have to, because I'm able to walk without a chair or a walker, I don't have to plan ahead of time to think of, is the restaurant going to enable me to get through the front door, let alone find an appropriate table to sit at. That's a privilege, and not having to think about that. I don't have to ask that question. There's a privilege in me being a white person who can walk down the street wearing a hoodie and not worry about my safety and security, not worry that somebody's going to look at me and think I'm more dangerous because of the color of my skin. My whiteness allows me that privilege that other folks don't necessarily have. And for example, one of the privileges that shows up for straight folks is that when you're in your workplace, perhaps you're putting up a picture of your partner. And if you're a straight person and I'm putting up a picture of my husband, I probably don't think twice about doing that at my desk, right? Like I have a picture of my partner at my workplace, and that's a common thing. If you're a queer person and you're not fully out, you would definitely think twice about whether or not you're going to put that picture up, because immediately you're going to get questions about it, right? It's a visible space, and folks are going to ask, you know, who is that? And you might not be ready to have that conversation. When I was working in Burnaby, I wasn't ready to have that conversation, so I didn't have pictures up. Another really common example in the queer community of how we self-closet and sort of experience discrimination is we don't use pronouns as easily. So a pronoun is he, her, his, she, right? So I can think of examples when I was in that situation and other jobs where, you know, you come in on Monday and people are asking about what you did on the weekend, and you're like, oh, that's great, she and I went to a movie, what I might say is, oh, it was great, like we had a Walking Dead marathon because I really like zombies, and you know, my friend really enjoyed it, they think zombies are great. So I've taken out any gendered pronouns of that sentence to avoid indicating what gender I was with, to avoid you asking me like, oh, she, who's she, right? Queer people do this all the time without even thinking about it. And it's something that a straight person probably doesn't think about very much, which gendered pronouns they're using in their regular discourse. And this is a place where English is really limited because we don't have a gender neutral pronoun, except for they, which is plural. So it's something that a lot of queer folks do to self-closet. So these kinds of privileges I'm talking about can extend, like I said, to all different types of diversity. There's privilege in your race, in your gender identity, and that can apply both to like male, female, but I also think about gender identity as transgender or cisgender. There's a lot of privilege that I experience as a cisgender woman. Sexual orientation, to ability, to class, to age, to your citizenship. All of these things inform our own privileges, and none of us are one-dimensional either. So a lot of the work that we do is talking about how these issues intersect. Because of course in the queer community, we're a community of communities. So there's this sort of like very tenuous thread that brings us together, which is that we have a non-normative sexual orientation or gender identity, that we're not part of the majority. But other than that, we're all different races and religions and class backgrounds and languages and citizenships and abilities. And so we have all of these layers, and everyone in this room does. We all have different layers in our identities, and I started by identifying some of mine, that I'm white, that I'm cisgender, that I'm able-bodied, that I'm Canadian-born, these kinds of things that inform how I experience the world. So I liked that at the end of the BC housing diversity definition, you had life experiences, right? All of these pieces inform how we walk down the street and what kind of interactions we have with people on transit. My partner is a person of color, and like without fail, every time she gets on the SkyTrain, the transit come and ask her for a ticket. I've never been asked for my ticket in 10 years of living here, ever. So I want to talk about an example of a project at Community where I want to acknowledge that like within the gay community, we also have a lot of privilege sometimes, and it doesn't make us sort of diversity experts that we might be gay. That in fact, sometimes there's folks who experience a lot more privilege in our community, and therefore we can be unintentionally exclusive as well. One of the ways this showed up was in our youth program. So I talked about our youth program. It's amazing. We get these youth from all across Metro Vancouver who take the SkyTrain in from Surrey, and they come from Maple Ridge, and they come from East Van to come and find a place where they can just be themselves, where they can meet other people like them, and where it feels safe. What happened a few years ago is we realized that newcomer youth, so new immigrants, often youth of color who were queer or trans, were coming once and then they weren't coming back. So they'd come to this drop-in, and when we sort of probed a little deeper and said, you know, like, well, why aren't you showing up again? Like, why aren't you coming to this regular space where there's always all these fun times and, you know, we have all these activities and everyone else is enjoying it? And they're like, yeah, it didn't feel comfortable for me as a newcomer, as someone whose English wasn't necessarily the first language, where there wasn't potentially a lot of other people of color in that space, where we were talking about issues of what it means to be an immigrant and dealing with like housing and finding a job and getting citizenship and all these kinds of things. This didn't feel like the right space. So as a result, we started a project called Roots to Roots, as in travel roots to tree roots. It's very clever. We think. And we really worked with this, you know, subgroup within our community to say, well, how can we make this space more inclusive? How can we make it more diverse? Why are we only serving this slice of people, and how can we engage you folks? And I think we had some, you know, there's no silver bullet. We didn't fix it overnight, and now we're perfectly safe, and all the newcomers come. But I think we had some traction in terms of engaging folks from this community and saying, okay, we're willing to make some changes. We need to reflect this diversity in the staff we're hiring, in the language we're using, in the policies that are plastered around the space, in the content of the programming. And we've seen an increase from this particular subgroup in our community. So an example of how we weren't necessarily being as inclusive as we could have within the queer community. And so I'm talking a lot about privilege, and I think we all have privileges, and I'm going to ask folks to reflect a bit more on that. I also want to, often when we talk about this, I want to acknowledge it can be challenging because we all have these layers of experience in our life, and when we went through the exercise, I think that you took us through in terms of who's experienced a time where they felt excluded, right? Bullied on the playground because of your gender or your race or your religion or something like that. So we all have experienced that. And conversely, I think we all experience privilege in different ways, but sometimes it can be challenging to balance, well, like I'm gay, I get discriminated against all the time. How could I be discriminating against somebody else? I think acknowledging these privileges that we hold it's not about guilt. It's not about, like, I don't want you to feel bad, because that doesn't get us anywhere and it makes folks defensive, and there's really no place to go from there. It's just about acknowledging the difference that we have in our communities, the difference of experiences that every individual has, so that we can start to notice things and break down our assumptions and maybe start to change our own behavior. So I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important, and this can be a challenging concept. Acknowledging our own privileges is not about feeling guilty. And I think what's, where I'm sort of going to focus and what I want to leave you folks with is really the role of allies. Because like we all have privileges in this room, we all have the potential to be allies to different folks. And in my job, like professional queer, head of a queer organization, talk about diversity all the time, and I identify as queer, but the reality is I'm an ally to almost everyone that I work with because I only have my own experience. So I only have that white, cis, queer, female, Canadian experience, so I'm an ally to those newcomer youth that are coming into our program. I'm an ally to gay men, because I'm not a gay man. I'm an ally to the trans folk, and we do a ton of work around trans issues, and for me that was a big learning curve when I came into the organization, is really digging deeper to understand trans issues, trans people, trans history, all of that. So I'm an ally to almost everyone that I work with, and I would challenge you to think about how you can be allies to the various experiences around you as well. And so a little bit about allyship and what good allyship looks like. An ally is somebody who really supports and celebrates those diverse identities. So specifically in my context, a queer ally would be someone who supports queer and trans identities and who willingly interrupts and challenges those homophobic or heterosexist remarks. So being in that Coquitlam gym, actually saying like, hey, that's not okay. Not because you necessarily know Michael's gay who's working out beside you, but because that's not an appropriate comment. We all carry these unintentional biases, and we're not necessarily conscious of them. Malcolm Gladwell wrote this he's written a lot of fun pop science books, but he wrote a book called Blink. Has anyone read that? And there's this, it's an interesting, he has a test in it. Malcolm Gladwell, for folks who don't know, is a Canadian-American author, and he's biracial. He's got a black parent and a white parent, and he has this test you can do where you sort of he gives you some black man running down the street, and you have to write the first thought that comes to your mind. There's kind of a checklist and stuff. He shares this as an example that he didn't realize as a black man that he carried these biases himself, but when he went through the test, he saw that he had a lot of stereotypes about black people in the US, or black people in general, that he wasn't aware of. And I've done the same test, and it's sort of uncomfortable because you're like, oh no, all people are equal. We're all this wonderful, happy rainbow family, and then there's this really deep stuff that's informed by all of those influences I told you about. Language when we're children, pop culture, dominant narratives, and so we carry these biases, and it's kind of our work as allies to dig deep and see what those biases are because they're not obvious. I also want to talk about how allies over the course of history have always been integral in every sort of social justice movement, from the civil rights movement to the gay rights movement to the women's movement. No movement has ever worked in isolation, and it's often taken the support of allies to really advance a social justice cause. And unfortunately, sometimes the power of an ally, and I say unfortunately because it's not necessarily fair, but the power of an ally, so my straight ally, is to be seen as less biased than I am, or taken more seriously, because potentially as an ally you have more social capital than the person within the group or the marginalized community that you're being an ally to, right? So if I say something as a queer person, it might be like, well, she might be exaggerating, or she's being really sensitive, right? She's being really sensitive. Actually, that wasn't a big deal. Language, whatever. She should have laughed it off. If a straight person says that beside me, they might get a little more attention paid to what they're saying. And the other thing about allyship is I talk about it as a destination, and that it's always under construction. So it's sort of, it's never automatic that and it's never perfected. I feel like as an ally in my work, I'm constantly looking at my own behavior and trying to dig deeper and challenge my own biases, and it's not easy. I do this diversity work, I think about this like 24/7, my partner will attest, I'm like, no fun at dinner parties. I'm like, well, are we being inclusive here? And yet, like, I'm far from immune, right? I can make these mistakes, and so I talked about how coming into this role at Community, I worked really hard to understand trans issues. I did some work around two-spirited issues. That was also an area where I felt like I needed to do more work in order to be a good ally. I did work around people of color within our community and their experiences. And yet I still managed to screw up. I screw up all the time. I'm going to give you one example. So one of the things when I came into Community is it seemed like a really white organization. And I'm white, and that didn't make any sense to me. As a Vancouver-based organization, we live in this incredibly multicultural city and region, and how could this be such a white organization? And that struck me as problematic right from the start. And so, I was like, well, I'm just gonna fix it. It'll take me a few months. It takes longer than that. And there's some learnings along the way that I've made, So it was just like, well, when I recruit people, when I hire people, when I recruit new board members and new staff, it'll just be better. So in this vein, I was trying to recruit new board members, and when we recruit board members, we're doing a number of things. We're looking at both technical skill sets, are they accountants or lawyers or communications folks or whatever. We've got that kind of matrix. And then equally important to us is that diversity matrix. So we're looking at age and gender identity and class and all of the beautiful rainbow of colors, right? But one of the priorities for us is that we had this all-white board, and we really wanted to recruit more people of color to bring that experience into the organization. So I found this great potential board member, and he's lovely. He was an acquaintance, and we're talking at a party, and I was like, would you ever consider being on the board? He was a developer. We're building this new $10 million facility. There was a nice match, and he was like, yeah, I'd be really interested in that. I've been looking to get more involved in philanthropy, and I was like, that's so awesome. And also, we're all white, and you're not, so that'll really be great, right? I don't even know if it came out something like that, right? And I really had this good intention of diversity is part of our strategic plan, and we've got these, we really need to expand the experiences. And his immediate answer to me was well, I'm also white. And I was like, oh my God. And he's a good friend now, and it's a biracial gay man, and I just totally put my foot in my mouth. I made an assumption, one, about his race, because he read to me as non-white, and he's half Filipino and he's half white, but I put that on him, jerk. And so, and I undermined his credibility and his other skill sets that he was bringing to the board. And so I just share that because I went home and I tell my partner the story, and she's like, Dara, and I was like, I know, I totally screwed up, right? And she's like, yeah, you did, but move forward, So I think we make these mistakes continually, and we have to give ourselves a little bit of room. I think you need to acknowledge it. You need to apologize, and then you need to move on and be better the next time, but it's going to keep happening. So just final thoughts on sort of how we become those great allies and how we move on from those mistakes that we all make. Don't make assumptions. It's really hard. They're really built into us. But try not to make assumptions about folks. So, that assumption that I shared at the beginning when someone walked into my office and assumed I was straight by using that language, there's simple switches you could make. If that person had come in and said, hey, do you have a partner? They're not making any assumptions. Maybe I am straight, maybe I'm queer, but there's room for me to come back, and there's a safety in that. So the same about the race example I just shared, or someone's religion, or so on. Don't make assumptions. Really try to listen. And that active listening is really important in that. Because people will offer stuff. So if there's space and you're not putting a label on them, there's more opportunity for growth. Really actively work to learn about other cultures. So one of the things that happens with these diversity sets that we're talking about, so like women or queers or disability, is that they're often expected to educate us as allies. And I want to turn that challenge around and put it on you, and really urge you to explore, different communities that you work within, and watch movies about those communities, or read articles about coming out of those communities. Do some of the research and the learning and unpacking yourself, and then come to those communities and be like, yeah, so I watched this movie Transamerica, and how accurate was that, or something, for a trans person in your life. But do some of the work yourself. Take the onus off these communities to be our educators. And then lastly, just pay attention. And as an ally, use that power to challenge environments that aren't as inclusive. So when you bump up against some of those situations, if you're another parent at the daycare and you watch this sort of like, one mommy, two mommy, one mommy, two mommy, and you know that this is a lesbian couple raising this child, you have this power as a straight ally to say, like, actually, he has two moms, And so use that power. Change is a work in progress. There is no silver bullet. Lots of mistakes are made, and that's okay. Just keep sort of paying attention. I often think about my own journey in diversity, and my ideas that I have today have evolved over 20 years of thinking and research and conversations, and I'm a little embarrassed at some of the things that I thought 20 years ago, and for me it's about not sitting in like guilt or feeling bad about myself. It's about evolving and moving on, and being an active listener and taking those experiences. So this is a journey. This is like, allyship is a journey. Somebody put that in quotations. Okay, I think I've taken up lots of time here. Thank you so much for having me.